Hello, I am Jayanto Chatterjee of IIT Kanpur, and we are interacting with you on managing services, contemporary issues in today's world. We are discussing since our last session about consumers in a services flow and the services consumer behavior. Consumer behavior is a subject of study by itself. We offer full semester courses on different sites, consumer behavior basic as well as consumer behavior advanced. But we are extracting from our understanding of consumer behavior those dimensions which are important for us to understand a services consumer. In the last session, we discussed issues relating to customers' expectation. In the last session, we saw how the need of a service comes up in consumer's mind and what happens thereafter. At the end of last session, we were talking about the desired service level in customer's mind, the adequate service level in customer's mind, and the zone of tolerance in between. And we concluded the last session with the understanding that we need to be above the blue line. We need to go from the level of what works, what is feasible, what is okay, to what wows, what delights the customer. And let's see today how that can happen by managing the in-service and the post-service stages well. So when a customer has taken a decision to acquire a particular service, to use a particular service, then already the customer has evaluated the alternatives with respect to those attributes that we discussed, the search attributes, the experience attributes, and the credence attributes. And we have discussed that it is easier to compare the alternatives when in those cases where search attribute dominates. Experience is a little bit more difficult, and credence attribute heavy services are more difficult to evaluate. And this easy to difficult, this is also based on risk perception. So customers' purchase decision on the left side of that graph that we showed, or the two humps that we showed in the previous session. So more tangible is the service, the more goods heavy is the offering, the more search attribute based decision making takes place, which is comparatively easier, but the complexities and the number of trade-offs go up as you go towards the right of that diagram. Go more to pure services, credence based services like medical treatment or legal service or education. So in these cases, the trade-offs are often laden with latent needs, not articulated needs. There are emotions involved, and in such cases, actually the post-encounter stage is as important as the service encounter stage. But anyway, in the service encounter stage, I will have to go back to some of the discussions that we have had before when we were looking at taking a macro view of the service business as a whole. One of them is this diagram that I had showed before, which is on the basis of which you are supposed to do an assignment in week 1. Remember, I had mentioned that you have to choose one of these high contact services like a nursing home or like a 4-star hotel or like a haircut or a good restaurant, and you were supposed to map the backstage activities as well as the front stage activities of this high contact service. But what we are saying today is that in the service encounter stage, in the high contact service, there is a higher level of need for knowledge flow from the service provider to the service consumer, quality information flow from the provider to the consumer, and it has to be at right points of time so that at the moments of truth, remember the discussion we had before, the moments of truth happen when the customer is at a touch point with the service. So we discussed with example that, for example, you are in a restaurant, then your touch point with the usher, your touch point with the steward, your touch point with the server, your touch point with the bill that comes to you. These are all moments of truth. The moments of truth are also points of failure. So we discussed, if you remember, that how we need to map the service, understand the flow of service, the flow diagram or the service blueprint, to understand these touch points and the moments of truth as well as the points of failure, possible failure. And during the service, the stage that we are now discussing, service encounter stage, we need to maintain a good level of knowledge flow so that there is a lesser chance of failure and a higher chance of generating satisfaction. We discussed some models like the Sarvakshan model earlier, which is a combination of service and production. We discussed this model when we discussed about the systems nature of services, where marketing and operations, marketing or human resource, operations and human resource cannot be segregated. They have to be thought of as a total system. We talked about the theater metaphor, that to ensure at the moments of truth at the touch point we maintain ensure to some extent standardization is by understanding the roles given to the service employees at those touch points and providing them with scripts. So if you have already done the Sarvakshan model work or the service blueprint work for one of these high contact services as your assignment in week 1, week 2, then this will become quite clear to you that how you need to manage the in-service stage or the service occurrence stage. And I think also I should highlight that the in-service stage management for a credence-based service will have to be most completely thought out. See that the knowledge flow is not interrupted. See that the anxiety level does not rise in the mind of the consumer. And similarly, in the experience heavy services, it is a bit easier than the credence heavy services, but we have to see that the touch points are well managed. So for example, famous theme parks like the so-called Disneyland, Disney World, if you see their the short movies which are available on the net, you will see how much training they put into their employees, how much care they take for the flawless operation of the systems, so that the service experience is safe, secure and pleasurable. Because obviously if they have all those joy rides and there are accidents, that can destroy a theme park business quite fast. So you have to not only ensure security, safety, pleasure, flow, but you have to also ensure it time after time, day after day, so that you have a 99.99% of safety record. So all the touch points need to be managed continuously for that level of high performance. That's why, for example, in experience heavy services like restaurants or haircuts and so on, quality management techniques like Six Sigma can be quite gainfully applied. We will discuss in lot more detail about the various models that are there for understanding customer satisfaction and quality of service. But today I would like to highlight that in service which is highly intangible and has all those other characteristics, understanding customers' expectation as they flow from pre-encounter to post-encounter stage is very important, because ultimately quality for an intangible service is evaluation in the customer's mind of the gap between the post-consumption perception with respect to the pre-consumption or in-consumption expectation. So perception after service and expectation before service or in service. This P minus E is the measure of quality, is the foundation of customer satisfaction models. There are elements inside. There are positive disconfirmation, confirmation and negative disconfirmation. That means feeling of better, same and worse. These are nuances of satisfaction. We will discuss that when we discuss service quality, service productivity and customer satisfaction relationships. We will also have to discuss about what goes beyond satisfaction and the customer delight or wow. The objective with which we looked at that blue level and the yellow level and our target of exceeding the blue level. What we have to understand is that the delight or wow happens when there is serendipity. There is unexpected high level of positive feeling, which therefore goes much beyond the need arousal and need satisfaction expectation. So this positive affect and unexpected affect, that creates the joy. And we'll have to look at some examples of how that happens. But most importantly, I would request you now, as an assignment for discussion in the forum, and I would request all of you to put in, share your experiences of those moments of any service. It could be a laundry service, it could be a musical recital, it can be a movie, but actually the movie or theater may be a little bit more difficult to describe. So choose services like high contact services or medium level of contact services. Think about your moments of joy during those services and write 1 or 2 paragraphs about how it happened and try to characterize what exactly gave you that joyful moment. What made that service touch point memorable? How do you recall and what are the emotions that are evoked when you think about that particular joyful service day, service occurrence? It will be good if you all share, then we will see how certain patterns emerge, and we may also explore that whether there is a linkage that is supported by your empirical experiences with respect to a service organization's performance. So whether there is a correlation between delight, satisfaction in the customer's mind with the financial performance, business performance of a service organization. So in summary, in the last 2 sessions, we have looked at these 3 stages of service consumption by the consumer: pre-purchase stage, service encounter stage, and post-encounter stage. The slide in front of you shows the key steps in each stage, like the need arousal, information search, evaluation, and purchase decision in case of the pre-purchase stage. The risk perception and management of the need of managing the risk perception in customer's mind that we discussed. The zone of tolerance that we discussed with respect to the pre-purchase stage. In the service stage, we talked about the moments of truth and the importance of understanding service as a complete system, as a seamless system where operations, marketing, human resource management, supply chain management have to all work as an integrated entity. All those functions have to be well coordinated to deliver the model that we had earlier discussed, Sarvakshan. And also we discussed about service as a theater, the metaphor of theater, and the importance of roles and scripts to create some levels of standardization in highly variable possibilities that occur during the service encounter between the service consumer and the service provider, because these are people to people happenings. And finally, we have discussed today that in the post-encounter stage, we have to understand that the customer's evaluation of service will be based on P minus E, post-encounter perception with respect to pre-encounter or in-encounter expectation. So this P minus E, which we will discuss in greater detail when we discuss service quality and productivity later on. So the last 2 sessions have shown us key dimensions of consumer behavior in the service domain and key factors that are important for us to build good service brands create customer satisfaction and ultimately customer delight, so that we have more and more customers as our co-marketers. In the next session, we will see that how this customer as co-marketer or customer as our advocate can happen through a process that we are now recognizing more and more as a very important process, which is the process of co-creation. All that next week. Thank you.